It's time to go over the basics. There are a lot of different RC car platforms out there these days, so many that it's pretty difficult to keep track of them all. And that's before you even get into all the electronic brands, tire brands, and so much more. For a beginner, it can be completely overwhelming, and that's already pretty normal. Maybe you've been bashing for a while and are looking to make that jump into racing, or perhaps you've been running a few slash classes here and there, perhaps in Mark Santa Maria's series, and want to grab a full-blown race vehicle. In this video, I'm going to do my best to help point you in the right direction and narrow down some choices to make them a bit easier. This video will be the first of a two-parter covering both the two most popular classes in 10th scale and 8th scale, two-wheel drive buggy and e-buggy respectively. Like usual, I'd like to thank A-Main Hobbies for supporting the channel. Anything you guys purchase using the links in the description below will directly support me as well. Before we look into individual buggies, let's ask ourselves a few questions to narrow down a few of the options that we'll go over a bit later. If you're watching this video, chances are you have a track that runs 10th scale in some capacity, be it primarily 10th scale or otherwise. If you're fortunate enough to have a 10th scale track close by, chances are the most popular class at said track will be two-wheel drive buggy. Even though there are more beginner-friendly classes, like for example stadium truck, it still makes more sense to go with the more popular class as to make sure every time you go to the track, you'll have a class to race in. Another question to ask is what surface your local track usually uses and what classes they offer. Starting with the surfaces, the two primary surfaces in the US will be indoor sealed clay and various forms of carpet. There are some places in the US where outdoor loose dirt is run, like Florida, but other than that it's mostly indoor clay and carpet. For Europe though, carpet and AstroTurf are the norm. Whichever surface you happen to race on will heavily determine which version of buggy you should buy. As for classes, things get a bit more complicated. Like I said before, the most popular class usually run at 10th scale events are going to be the buggy classes, specifically two-wheel drive and four-wheel drive buggy. Even though four-wheel drive buggies are arguably easier to drive, they are more expensive to buy and maintain compared to their two-wheel drive counterparts. Two-wheel drive buggies, on the other hand, may be more difficult to drive and set up, but are much cheaper to buy and maintain. Whichever one you happen to buy will more or less depend on personal taste and financial situation. For the purposes of this video, we'll be focusing mainly on two-wheel drive buggy. Two-wheel drive buggy also happens to have a few different subclasses compared to other classes like stadium truck. At most larger tracks, they will usually have a novice class where people can get used to driving on a track. Specifically pertaining to two-wheel drive though, there are a lot of different subclasses depending on the track you happen to be located at. Some places will run 21.5 motors in a stock independent class, others will run the standard 17.5. We'll talk about motors in a little bit. Others outside the US won't have a stock class at all, and you'll sort of be left to your own devices in terms of how much power you want. Be sure to research the classes run at your local track and pick one that you would feel most comfortable in. We'll go over all the electronics and such a little bit later in this video. For now though, let's take a look at a few of the two-wheel drive buggies that are most popular today. There are a few different two-wheel drive buggies out there for very similar prices to each other, right around the $400 to $450 price tag for a kit. Little side tangent here. Keep in mind when you buy pretty much any and all racing vehicles, they will not come pre-assembled. You will need to build them yourself and supply your own electronics, tires, and sometimes wheels. Many who are getting into racing and only have run RTR cars before may see this as a bad thing, but trust me, it helps a lot in the long term. Being able to build the car from a carefully constructed bag of parts will give you a much better idea of how to fix the car if and when something goes wrong. And if you're just starting out, trust me, something will go wrong. Anyway, with that side tangent over, let's talk more about two-wheel drive buggies. There are quite a few out there at the moment, and I did make a video talking about each and every two-wheel drive buggy on the market, but that video is a bit outdated, so I'll stick to with the brands that are much more popular these days, which also happen to be new releases. The Team Associated B7 is the newest two-wheel drive buggy from Team Associated, and it's been doing moderately well in the world of RC as of now. The reason I say moderately well and not great is because even though the B7 drives extremely well on all surfaces, even surprisingly on loose dirt, its durability has come into question, particularly with the C&D block and some people bending chassis. Some companies have already made replacements for the ones that come with the kit to make them more durable. Even though the durability is a bit iffy at the moment, I would say that the B7 is a solid choice of buggy if you want excellent part support and a really good driving buggy from the jump. Another new buggy that's been released recently is the Mugen MSB1. The MSB1 is Mugen's first foray into the world of two-wheel drive buggy, and they seem to have done a rather good job. Lots of people like to call it the TRR 22 6.0 because of its looks, and I can see where a lot of people would get that impression. it looks like everything people would want in a new 2020 TLR 22 6.0, and I've already seen a few TLR drivers make the switch. Not only that, but due to the nature of how Mugen Seiki releases cars, you won't have to worry about them releasing a new version of the MSP1 anytime soon, allowing you to master the buggy as it is. The only issue with this car is parts support, though that's not really too much of an issue as the parts are very heavily stocked on their one website, but that's just that, it's only one website. Other places haven't really stocked Mugen 10 scale parts yet, as it's a brand new platform and experiment from Mugen. Overall though, it is a very good and very durable option. Speaking of options, there is also the Schumacher LD3. The LD3 can be bought in 3 different configurations: the stock spec, the mod spec, and the dirt spec. The mod car is the flagship and standard version of the LD3. The stock spec is roughly the same but comes with a carbon fiber chassis and other lightweight goodies. The dirt spec comes with different rear hubs and a different layback transmission along with a few other changes. Now, which one you should choose is pretty much entirely based on where you are and where you plan on racing. It wouldn't make much sense to buy a stock spec car in a place like the UK where stock isn't very popular. It also wouldn't make sense to buy a dirt spec car if you only plan on running on carpet tracks. Even though you can run Schumacher perfectly well even in a low grip track, Schumachers tend to work best on high grip carpet and AstroTurf tracks, as that's what's most used in Schumacher's native UK. Because of this, at carpet tracks around the world, including the United States, Schumacher parts tend to be abundant. The only issue with Schumacher is they tend to be a bit more on the fragile side compared to other buggies on the market today. So unless your track has parts on standby or perhaps you're willing to spend more on spare parts from the get-go, Schumachers may not be for you. There are other two-wheel-drive buggies on sale in the modern world of RC, but the 3 I mentioned are the main ones that you'll see on the track with the exception of the Losi 22 5.0, which from everything I've heard on the grapevine, is on its way out. Whichever cars you happen to choose, be sure it's well supported at your local track. If most people happen to run the Yokomo SO 2.0, that might be a good option as you have good resources available to you if something goes wrong or you have any questions about your car. Moving on to electronics, specifically batteries, keep in mind that pretty much every and any 10 scale race buggy or truck will use a 2S shorty pack and will accept nothing else. This keeps things relatively simple, but even here we have some variation. Starting with the 2 types of 2S batteries, high voltage and regular LiPos. Regular LiPos or 2S LiPos are rated at 7.4 volts, whereas a 2S high voltage battery is rated at 7.6 volts. This gives the high voltage batteries a bit more power, but it isn't always necessary for bigger races where the voltage of your battery is limited based on certain ROR rules. It's also important to note that even though HV batteries can be charged on a regular LiPo voltage, you cannot charge a regular battery or a regular LiPo battery on high voltage. It will combust and probably burn something down. Invest in an ammo box or LiPo bag. Another thing about most 2S shorty packs is that they use 5mm bullet connectors instead of the usual Deans or XT60 connectors. This is to save weight and space, as under a 10 scale buggy body, there is very little space to be had. It also, in my opinion, looks a lot better when done well. Some cheaper shorty packs will use 4mm bullet connectors, and it's perfectly fine if you want to use those. Just make sure you take good care of them and buy from a brand you can trust, as once again, LiPo fires are no joke. Another variation for 2S shorty packs is the actual height of the battery. A regular size 2S pack is just that, a regular size 2S pack. These packs are usually either used in two-wheel-drive buggies that are under the weight limit of using a smaller pack, during long mains, in 8th scale application, or in truck classes like short course truck or stadium truck. LCG or low center of gravity packs are basically shorter 2S packs to bring the center of gravity as low as possible. These batteries are generally better for buggies in shorter sprints that don't really exceed 8 minutes. They also don't really work in truck classes as they are simply too light for the suspension on those trucks to work properly, or so I'm told. Next up we have the ESC and motor. Once again, it's much simpler than many might think, as all two-wheel drive buggies use the same size motor and pretty much the same size ESCs. 540 size motors on pretty much all 10 scale vehicles, specifically buggies and trucks, are the standard, and you can find them pretty much easily by just using a filter on your chosen RC shop or asking one for the counter at a hobby shop. Where things can get a bit confusing is which 540 sided motor do I get for my application. For the purposes of this video, we'll be talking about two-wheel drive buggy primarily. 540 size motors in the world of 10-scale racing are rated differently compared to other sized motors. Whereas other motors are rated via kV, 10-scale racing motors are rated in turns. I'm not going to go too into detail as to what a lower or higher turn motor entails internally. What I will say is that the general rule for turns is that the lower the turn rating, the less resistance, and thus the more power. This is why you'll see drag cars running 3.5 to even 2.5 turn motors. For two-wheel drive buggy and most other applications for 10 scale, I wouldn't go much below 8.5 turns if you're just starting out, as you're going to need a very strong ESC and be a very good driver to make use of it, anything lower. This is where stock racing comes into play, where everyone uses the same turn motor. This is really only popular in the US, but there are some pockets across the pond where there are limited turn classes. For Europe, though, it would seem as though 13.5 is the current turn rating for stock races, if there are any being run to begin with. In America, like I said before, it's usually 17.5 or sometimes even 21.5 for novice level drivers or independent drivers. ESCs in terms of size are going to be roughly the same depending on which one you happen to get. There are lots of options with varying prices and usages. If you're just getting started and want a more legal option and you happen to run a stock class, you have the Hobbywing Z-Run Just Stock and the Reedy Black Box 600Z G2, both with reasonable prices coming in right around $60 to $65. For a bit cheaper, you can go with a cheaper ESC that will handle mod motors, but they will not be allowed in Blinky 17.5 and 21.5 classes, which most places run. If you plan on running a mod motor and don't care about being more legal, then you can run these Hobbywing 10BL ESCs, both in 60 amp for stock motors and 120 amp for anything down to 4.5 turns for two-wheel drive off-road vehicles. For servos, things are quite simple for the most part. A standard or low-profile servo will work just fine in pretty much all applications for 10-scale two-wheel drive. You don't need to break the bank. It's important to note also that anything and everything I've mentioned will be listed in the description below with multiple options to choose from. Now, even though I listed everything that I'd recommend, including some options in the description below that you can buy using those links, I would still recommend buying local if you can. If you were to buy a B7, for example, it would make a lot more sense to just walk into the store you happen to race at and buy the B7 there and just walk out the same day, rather than buy one online and have to wait a few days before the race day. Feel free to use the links in the description below that I listed if you happen to buy them, and I do appreciate if you do. However, if you want my recommendation, I would buy local if you can. Now, if you excuse me, I have a kit to build.